The memo was paper-clipped to the tape. That's the first thing I want you to understand. It wasn't loose in the box. It wasn't tucked into a folder. It wasn't filed somewhere a person could miss. My father had taken a steel paperclip, the cheap kind that comes 100 to a plastic tub, and fastened a folded sheet of yellow legal paper directly to the VHS sleeve. The clip had rusted into the cardboard. When I pulled it free, it left 2 small brown commas on the spine, and the paper came away with a crackle, like dry leaves. He had been dead 11 days. I was sitting on the floor of his garage in Linwood, a town in southern Michigan that exists mostly as a frontage road and a feed store, and a Lutheran church that shares a parking lot with a credit union. My father had lived in the same yellow ranch house for 31 years. He had not thrown anything away in that time. Not seriously, not the way a person should. My job as the only child was to decide which of his possessions deserved a U-Haul and which deserved a contractor bag. The box marked Home Videos was on the 3rd shelf from the bottom, behind a snowblower he had not used since my mother died. Inside the box were 43 VHS tapes in their original sleeves, most of them labelled in my father's careful block printing: Christmas 1994, Danny birthday 7, camping trip Tukwamanon. One tape near the back had no label on the spine, only a piece of masking tape on the front, with the marker code 44-C. The memo, when I unfolded it, was written on a sheet torn from a yellow pad. My father's handwriting. He had used a blue ballpoint, and he had pressed hard enough that the words were grooved into the paper. There were 5 lines. Evidence processing Memo. Tape 44-C. Do not view with others present. Do not copy. Never enhance. That was it. No signature, no date, no explanation. The word evidence had been underlined twice. The word never had been underlined 3 times. The 3rd stroke so hard it had torn through the paper. I sat in the garage for a long time with the tape in my lap. The light through the dirty window over the workbench was the colour of weak tea. I could hear a dog barking 3 yards over. The same dog that had barked at me every morning that week. A black lab named Pepper who belonged to my father's neighbour Frank. Frank had brought a casserole on the 2nd day and stayed on the porch to tell me my father had been a good man. A quiet man. The kind of neighbour you wanted. He had not mentioned anything that would explain a memo written like a warning to himself. My father had not been a police officer, a lawyer, a private investigator, or any other kind of person who would have a reason to use the word evidence about a home video. He had been a regional sales manager for a company that made industrial floor coatings. He had retired in 2011. He had played in a poker game on Thursdays. He had read large print westerns. He had not, to my knowledge, ever owned a video camera until I bought him a small camcorder for Christmas in 1998, when I was 11, because he said he wanted to film the goldfinches at the back feeder. I want to be honest about my state of mind that afternoon because I think it matters. I was 38 years old. I had been divorced for 2 years. I had driven up from Cincinnati alone in a rented Corolla. I had not cried at the funeral, and I had not cried since, and I was at the stage of grief where the lack of crying was beginning to feel like a problem I would have to solve later, after I was done with the house. I was eating mostly gas station food. I was sleeping in my childhood bedroom, on a mattress that smelled like the inside of a guitar case. I was, in the language of the grief pamphlet the funeral home had pressed into my hand, not yet processing. So when I read the memo, my first reaction was not fear. It was a kind of dim, embarrassed tenderness. My father, the man who had labelled his Christmas tapes by year, had at some point in his life felt strongly enough about a single unlabelled video cassette to write himself a warning in legal pad capitals and clip it to the sleeve with a steel paper clip. The memo was the most dramatic thing I had ever found of his. It was, in a small and stupid way, the most interesting thing he had ever done. I took the tape inside. The TV in the den was a Panasonic from sometime in the late 90s, a heavy black cube with a rounded screen and a built-in VCR slot in the front. My father had owned 3 televisions in his life, and he had kept this one because he said, the new ones made everyone's faces look wet. The remote had been lost for at least a decade. To operate the VCR, you had to press the grey rubber buttons on the front panel, which clicked with the satisfying mechanical resistance of a piece of equipment manufactured before the industry had decided the customer wanted everything to feel like nothing. I sat on the couch with a beer from the fridge. I had been drinking my father's beer for a week. There were still 9 cans left, a brand called Pabst that I had not known he drank, and I had developed an affection for them that I knew was about him and not about the beer. I slid tape 44-C into the slot. The VCR pulled it in with a soft mechanical whomp. The screen went black, then blue, then resolved into the static frosted grey that VHS produces when the tape is rolling but has not yet reached recorded content. The first thing I saw was my father's living room. This living room. The same brown couch I was sitting on. The same coffee table with the water ring shaped like an apostrophe. The same lamp with the pleated shade that my mother had bought at a yard sale in Saginaw the summer before her diagnosis. The camera was on a tripod, or on a shelf, or possibly on top of the television itself. The angle was slightly elevated and very still. The image was crisp for VHS. The colours were warm. There was no one in the frame. A timestamp ran in the lower right corner in white digital numerals, 3:14 a.m. The date read August 17th, 2002. August 17th, 2002. I would have been 15 that summer. I would have been asleep upstairs. For the first 40 seconds, nothing happened. The room sat empty. The lamp was off. The light in the room came from somewhere out of frame, probably the kitchen, and it was the dim yellow of an under-cabinet fluorescent that my mother had insisted on leaving on overnight because she didn't like getting up to a dark house. I remembered that light. I remembered the sound of it. The faint electric hum that filled the kitchen when everything else in the house was off. At 43 seconds, my father walked into the frame. He was wearing the blue flannel robe I remembered. He was barefoot. His hair was the colour it had been when I was a teenager, the salt and pepper that had not yet committed to grey. He was carrying a glass of water. He walked across the living room slowly, the way a person walks who is trying not to wake anyone, and he sat down on the couch. He did not look at the camera. He sat for a long time. He drank his water. He set the glass on the coffee table, on the apostrophe-shaped ring, which I now understood was a ring he had made himself over the years. In the middle of the night, he put his face in his hands. I leaned forward. My father, the man who had not cried at his own wife's funeral, the man who had been so contained at my mother's wake that one of her sisters had said something unkind about him in the parking lot, was sitting on his couch in the dark in 2002, with his face in his hands, and his shoulders were shaking. I watched him cry for almost 2 minutes. At the 3-minute mark, he lifted his head, wiped his face on the sleeve of the robe, picked up the empty glass, and walked out of the frame toward the kitchen. The room was empty again. The timestamp continued to roll. 3:17 a.m., 3:18 a.m., 3:19 a.m. Then cut to black. A new image faded in. Same living room, same angle, different timestamp. 2:48 a.m., April 11th, 2:02. 3 months later, the lamp was off. The kitchen light was on. The room was empty. After 90 seconds, my father walked in. Same robe, same glass of water. He sat down. He drank. He set the glass on the table. He put his face in his hands. This time he didn't cry. He just sat. He sat for a long time, and then he reached up and pressed the heels of his hands into his eyes, the way a child does when a child is very tired, and he held them there. Cut to black. A new timestamp. 3:31 a.m., February 9th, 2003. Same room, same chair. He came in, he sat. I want you to understand, I had no idea my father had ever done this. I had lived in this house. I had slept directly above this couch from 1998 to 2005. I had never once come down the stairs at night and found him here. I had assumed, with the casual cruelty of a teenager, that he slept the way I slept, in the dumb black tunnel of a healthy young animal, and woke up because the alarm told him to. The tape went on. There were maybe a dozen of these clips, each 2 or 3 minutes long, each time-stamped, each in the same room from the same angle. The timestamp spanned from August 2002 to June 2005. My father had, at some point in the summer of 2002, set up a video camera in his own living room aimed at the couch, and he had let it run, and he had recorded himself coming downstairs at night for almost 3 years. Why? I drank my beer. I was not afraid. I was, in fact, the closest to tears I'd been since I'd gotten the phone call from Frank 10 days earlier. I thought, oh, Dad, oh, you sad man, oh, I'm sorry. And then the tape did something I could not explain. It was the clip dated April 12th, 2003, around the 28-minute mark of the tape. The timestamp read 3:02 a.m. My father came into the frame. He sat on the couch. He drank his water. He set the glass down. He put his face in his hands. And then, while his face was in his hands, the lamp turned on. The lamp with the pleated shade, the one my mother had bought at the yard sale in Saginaw. It was off when my father walked into the room. It was off when he sat down. It was off when he put his face in his hands. And then, between one frame and the next, with no flicker and no warming filament, it was on. The bulb went from dark to a steady, even 40-watt yellow, as if a switch had been thrown. My father did not react. He sat with his face in his hands under the lit lamp for another 40 seconds. Then he stood up, picked up the empty glass, and walked out of the frame toward the kitchen. The lamp stayed on. The room sat empty in the warm yellow light. The timestamp rolled forward for another minute, then the lamp turned off the same way it had turned on. No flicker, no fade. Off, cut to black. I rewound. I watched it again. I watched it 3 times. I am telling you, as cleanly as I can, that the lamp turned itself on while my father's face was in his hands and turned itself off after he left the room, and my father did not so much as flinch. I reached for my beer and found that I had already finished it. I went to the kitchen and got another. While I was in the kitchen, I looked at the lamp. It was still in the living room. It was still on the side table next to the couch. It had been there my entire life. It was a cheap pewter base with a glass column up the middle, and a yellowed pleated shade with a small brown burn mark near the bottom, where my mother had once set down a lit cigarette and forgotten about it for a count of 2. I had not thought about the burn mark in 20 years. I went back to the den. I rewound the tape. I let it play from the beginning of the April 12th, 2003 clip. The lamp turned on at the same moment. Of course it did. That's how tape works. But this time, while I was watching for it, I caught something I had missed. In the half-second before the lamp turned on, my father, with his face still in his hands, tilted his head, not toward the lamp, toward the corner of the room, the corner that was out of frame behind the camera. It was a small motion, the way a person turns an ear toward a sound. And then the lamp came on, and he did not look up, and 40 seconds later he stood and left the room. I paused the tape. I sat in the den, and I listened to my father's house. The refrigerator was running. The dog 2 yards over was no longer barking. Somewhere outside, a car passed on the frontage road. The lamp on the side table next to me, the same lamp, was off. I had not turned it on since I had arrived. I reached over and pulled the chain. The bulb did not come on. It was burned out. I did not know how long it had been burned out. My father had been dead 11 days. And before that, he had been the only person in the house, and I had no way of knowing whether the lamp had worked the day he died or whether it had been dark for years. I sat in the den, and I watched the rest of tape 44-C. There were more anomalies. I will list them in the order I noticed them, because I want to be precise. In the clip dated July 28th, 2003, my father came into the room, sat down, and drank his water. While he was drinking, the coffee table moved. Not far, about an inch, toward the couch. The water glass, which was on the table, moved with it. My father set the glass down in the new position and did not appear to register that the table was an inch closer than it had been. The apostrophe-shaped water ring, which I now understood was the slow record of a man who had repeatedly placed a glass on a slightly moving table, was suddenly comprehensible in a way I did not want it to be. In the clip dated November 19th, 2003, the kitchen light, which had been on at the start of the clip, went off halfway through. The room dropped into near total darkness, lit only by a faint blue that came from somewhere I could not identify. My father, in the dark, on the couch, did not move. He sat for almost a full minute in the dark. Then the kitchen light came back on, and he stood up and left. In the clip dated March 8th, 2004, there was a sound. The audio on the tape had been almost silent for the entire recording, just the faint hum of the camera and the deeper hum of the kitchen fluorescent. But at 3:11 a.m. on March 8th, 2004, while my father was sitting on the couch with his face in his hands, a voice said something. I rewound it 4 times. I could not make out a word or even a language. It was a low murmur, very brief, the rhythm of a short sentence. It came from off-camera, from the same corner my father had tilted his head towards in the April 2003 clip. My father, in March of 2004, did not tilt his head. He had stopped tilting his head, I realized. Sometime in late 2003, he had become accustomed. In the clip dated June 22nd, 2004, my father came into the room, sat down, and was not alone. I want to be careful here because I have watched this clip many times, and I am still not certain what I saw. There was a shape on the couch next to him. It was not a person. It was not anything I would describe as a shape if pressed. It was more like the impression a person leaves on a couch cushion after they have stood up, except the impression was on the cushion while my father was sitting beside it, and the impression was the size and weight of an adult, and it did not move for the entire duration of the clip. My father, again, did not appear to notice. He drank his water. He set the glass down. He put his face in his hands. He cried briefly. He left. When he left, the impression on the cushion remained for another 4 seconds. Then the cushion released, slowly, the way a cushion releases when a person stands up from it. Then the clip cut to black. I watched that clip 7 times. I should say here that I am not a person who believes in ghosts. I am not a person who believes in much. My father had not believed in much either. He had attended the Lutheran church for 31 years because my mother had wanted him to. And after she died, he had continued attending for 2 more years, and then he had quietly stopped. He had told me once on the phone that the building had become uncomfortable for him, and I had not asked what he meant. I watched the rest of tape 44-C in one sitting. There were 41 clips ending in a clip dated June 4th, 2005, which was the last clip on the tape and which I will describe in its place. When I was done, it was almost midnight. I had drunk 4 of my father's beers. The house was very quiet. I turned off the TV and I went to the kitchen and I stood under the under-cabinet fluorescent, which still worked, and I looked at the small space between the kitchen counter and the wall, where the kickplate had pulled away from the cabinets, and I thought about how long my father had stood in this kitchen alone after my mother died, getting glasses of water at 3 in the morning and walking out into the living room, where something he could not explain was waiting on the couch. I went upstairs and I slept badly. The next morning I made coffee and I read the memo again. Do not view with others present. I had viewed it alone. Fine. Do not copy. I had not copied it. Fine. Never enhance. I sat with that one for a long time. The word enhance was strange. It was a word you used about a photograph, not a videotape. It was the word a detective said on a television show, leaning over a technician's shoulder, while the technician moved a slider and made a fuzzy license plate sharp. It was a word that implied a particular kind of work, the deliberate clarification of an image to extract information that the image was hiding. My father had owned a flatbed scanner, a desktop computer, a printer that no longer printed, and a stack of blank DVDs in cellophane. He had not, to my knowledge, owned video editing software. He had not been the kind of person who would have known how to enhance a tape. So the memo was not, I thought, a warning to himself in the practical sense. He had not been at risk of enhancing the tape. The memo was a warning to whoever found the tape. The memo was, in other words, for me. I made breakfast. I called the funeral home and confirmed the time for the disposition of the headstone. I called my ex-wife and left a short voicemail about a piece of furniture she had asked to be saved for our nephew. I drove into town and bought groceries. I sat in the parking lot of the credit union for 15 minutes with the engine off and watched a man load a pallet of softener salt into the back of a pickup truck. I did not cry. I drove home. In the afternoon, I opened my laptop. I want to be clear that I knew what I was doing. I knew, sitting at my father's kitchen table, with my father's memo on the placemat next to me and my father's water glass sweating onto the wood, that I was about to disobey the only instruction my father had ever left me. I knew this. I want it on the record. I had a video capture device in the trunk of my car, left over from a project I had abandoned the year before, when I had briefly tried to digitize my ex-wife's family's old camcorder footage as a Christmas gift. I brought it inside. I unboxed the cables. I pulled the VCR out of the den, carried it into the kitchen, plugged it into the back of the capture device, and the capture device into my laptop. I opened the software. I inserted tape 44-C. The capture process took almost 3 hours, because VHS plays at the speed VHS plays, and you cannot enhance what you have not yet captured. While the tape rolled, I sat at the kitchen table, and I read a book about the Battle of Vicksburg that I had pulled off my father's shelf at random. I did not look at the screen. When the capture was finished, I had a 48-gigabyte digital file on my laptop. I opened it in a piece of software I had downloaded free Popular, the kind of program a person uses to clean up old family videos. I want you to understand that I did not have access to anything specialized. I was not in a lab. I was a man at a kitchen table with a laptop and a free trial of a consumer program. I scrolled to the clip dated June 22nd, 2004, the one with the impression on the cushion. I selected the segment. I applied the program's Enhance function, which was a checkbox labeled Auto Enhance, with a brief tooltip that explained the program would attempt to sharpen detail, balance color, and reduce grain. I clicked it. The progress bar took about 90 seconds. When it was done, I pressed play. The clip looked different. The colors were more saturated. The grain was lower. The image was sharper by a small but visible margin. My father on the couch looked younger and more present. The lamp was brighter. The water glass caught a glint I had not seen before. The shape on the cushion next to him was a man. I want to describe him carefully because I have spent a long time trying to be careful about him. He was an older man, maybe in his 70s. He was wearing a brown cardigan over a white collared shirt. His hands were folded in his lap. His feet, in dark trousers and brown shoes, were flat on the floor. He was sitting upright with the kind of formal posture a person uses in a dentist's waiting room. His face was turned slightly towards my father. but his eyes were on the camera. He was looking directly at the camera. In the unenhanced version of the tape, he had been an impression in a cushion. In the enhanced version, he was a man. The enhancement had not added him. The enhancement had only resolved him out of the noise. He had been there the entire time. My father had been sitting next to him for 2 minutes and 43 seconds on the morning of June 22nd, 2004, and my father had not turned his head. I did not recognize the man. I want to be clear about that. He was not someone I had ever seen. He did not resemble my grandfather, who had died in 1986, or my mother's father, whom I had never met, or any of my father's friends from the poker game, or anyone from the church, or Frank, or any uncle or cousin or neighbour I could place. He was a stranger. He had a stranger's face. He looked the way a person looks in a photograph in a stranger's house, where you understand that this is somebody to somebody, but he is not anybody to you. He was looking directly at the camera. I closed the laptop. I went outside. I stood in my father's driveway. It was the middle of the afternoon. The sky was the colour of skim milk. Frank's dog Pepper was barking at me from across the yard. I waved at her the way I had been waving all week, and she did not stop barking. I walked down to the end of the driveway. I checked the mailbox. There was a circular for a tyre sale at the Goodyear in Bay City. I walked back up to the house. I went inside. I sat at the kitchen table. I opened the laptop. The clip was still paused on the same frame. The man in the brown cardigan was still looking at the camera. He was still looking at me. I will try to describe what happened over the next 4 days as clearly as I can, but I will warn you that my memory of those 4 days is not reliable. I know this. I am not going to pretend it is. I did not watch the rest of the enhanced clip. I closed the program. I deleted the enhanced file. I emptied the recycle bin. I unplugged the capture device. I put it back in its box, and I carried the box out to my car, and I locked it in the trunk. I told myself that the unenhanced tape was fine. The memo had said never enhance. It had not said never watch. I had viewed it alone. I had not copied it. The capture, I told myself, did not count, because I had deleted it, and I had now stopped enhancing. I complied with 3 out of 3 instructions retroactively, if I was generous with the timeline. I went back to the den. I put the VCR back. I sat on the couch. I did not put the tape back in. The lamp with the pleated shade was on the side table to my right. The bulb was burned out. I had confirmed this the night before. I confirmed it again now by pulling the chain. The bulb did not respond. I sat on the couch for a long time. The brown couch, the same couch. The cushion to my left, where the man in the brown cardigan had been sitting, was empty. I could see the slight depression in the foam from 30 years of my father sitting on it in roughly the same spot, watching the news in the evenings, waking up at 3 in the morning, and coming downstairs in his blue flannel robe. The depression on the cushion to my left was a different depression from the one to my right. They had been made by different bodies. I want to say here that I knew this was a stupid thing to notice. People sit on couches in many places. Cushions wear unevenly. My mother had sat on that side too. For the first 18 years they had lived in the house. I knew all of this. I knew the explanation. I was telling it to myself even as I was looking at the cushion. I was, in the language of the grief pamphlet, processing. That was the first day. On the second day I drove to the storage unit my father had rented in 2008, the year after my mother died, which I had not yet opened. The key was on his key ring, labelled SU in the same blue ballpoint he had used for the memo. The unit was at a facility on the north side of town, behind a chain-link fence with a coded gate. The code was written on a sticky note in his wallet. He had not made this difficult. The unit was a 5 by 10. Inside were 6 plastic tubs, a rolled rug, a folded card table, and a wooden cabinet about the size of a small refrigerator, which I did not recognize. I opened the cabinet first. It was a record cabinet. My father had not owned a record player, to my knowledge, since I was very small. But the cabinet was full of records, maybe 60 or 70 of them, arranged alphabetically. They were not albums I associated with him. They were mostly classical, with some old vocal jazz and a few choral recordings I could not identify. On top of the cabinet, under a fine layer of dust, were 3 framed photographs. I picked up the first one. It was a black and white portrait of a man in his early 70s. He was wearing a brown cardigan. I could tell it was brown, even in black and white, the way you can sometimes tell over a white collared shirt. His hands were folded in front of him. He was looking directly at the camera. He had a stranger's face. He was the man on the couch. I turned the photograph over. There was a label on the back, written in a handwriting I did not recognize, in a fountain pen. It read, Walter A., June 1979. That was all. I want to tell you that I knew, in that moment, what was happening. I want to tell you that I sat down on the concrete floor of the storage unit and put it all together. I did not. I stood there with the photograph in my hand, and I felt the way you feel when you walk into a room and forget why. I felt a kind of empty hum. I put the photograph back on the cabinet. I closed the cabinet. I left the storage unit. I drove home. I did not eat dinner. I slept. That was the second day. On the third day, I called my father's sister, my Aunt Marcy, who lived in Florida and whom I had last seen at my mother's funeral. I asked her if our family had ever known a Walter. There was a long pause on the line. I could hear her television in the background, some kind of cooking program, a woman explaining how to skin a tomato. Walter who? She said. I don't know, I said. I found a photograph in Dad's storage unit. A man named Walter, June 1979. June of 79, she said. Yeah, there was another pause. Danny, she said. You were not born yet in June of 79. I know, I said. I am 38. Your father was 26. He was living in Lansing. He was not married yet. He had a roommate. Okay. His roommate's name was Walter. I sat down at the kitchen table. Walter, what? I said. I don't remember Walter's last name, she said. He was a few years older than your father. He was a graduate student at Michigan State. He and your father had a house together on Beach Street. I visited once. It's a nice house. Walter was a nice man. What happened to him? There was a very long pause. Danny, she said, why are you asking me this? I just want to know. Walter died, she said, in the house, while your father was at work. Your father came home and found him. It was a thing with his heart, I think. Something congenital. He was very young. How young? 30, she said. 31, I don't remember exactly. Your father took it very hard, Danny. He took it very hard. He wasn't really himself again until he met your mother. And that was almost 3 years later. He didn't talk about Walter. We didn't talk about Walter. It was a different time. A different time, I said. Yes, she said. We did not say anything for a while. I could hear the cooking program telling someone how to remove a tomato from boiling water with a slotted spoon. I could hear my aunt breathing, far away in Florida, in a house I'd never been to. Danny, she said, are you okay up there? I'm fine, I said. Is there anything else you want to ask me? No, I said. Thank you, Aunt Marcy. I love you. I'll call you next week. I love you too, she said. I hung up. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time. I thought about my father, 26 years old, in a house on Beach Street in Lansing, with a graduate student named Walter, in 1979, in a different time. I thought about my father coming home from work and finding him. I thought about the 3 years between then and my mother. I thought about the 31 years he had lived in this house with my mother and me, and the years after my mother died when he had lived in it alone and I thought about him coming downstairs at 3 in the morning to a couch where a man in a brown cardigan was sitting, and not turning his head, because turning his head was something he had stopped being able to do a long time ago. I thought about the memo, "Do not view with others present." He had not wanted me to see Walter with anyone else in the room. He had not wanted to have to explain. He had been a private man, from a different time, and he had loved a person he had never told his sister he had loved, and he had set up a camera in his own living room because he had needed to know whether the person was still there. Do not copy. He had not wanted Walter distributed. He had not wanted Walter on more than one piece of magnetic tape in the world. Never enhanced. I sat with this for a long time too. I thought I understood it. I thought he had not wanted to see Walter clearly. I thought he had been content in his life as it was, to sit beside a blur and to leave the blur unresolved, because resolving it would have meant looking at it, and looking at it would have meant looking at the rest of his life, which was a life he had built carefully on the condition of not looking. That was a generous reading of the memo. I want to acknowledge that. I want to acknowledge that I sat at my father's kitchen table on the third day and constructed a tender and sympathetic explanation for the warning he had left me, and that the explanation made me feel close to him in a way I had not felt close to him in a long time, and that the explanation allowed me to keep the part of the experience that I wanted to keep, the recognition that my father had loved someone, had grieved someone, had been a fuller person than I had given him credit for, to discard the part I did not want, which was the man on the couch looking at the camera. I want to acknowledge that I was wrong. The fourth day was the day I watched the last clip. I had not watched it on the first night. I had stopped after the June 22nd, 2004 clip, the one with the impression on the cushion. There had been almost half an hour of tape left. I had told myself I would watch it later, on the fourth day, after I had hung up with my aunt, after I had constructed my generous reading, after I had decided I understood. I went to the den and I put tape 44-C back into the VCR, and I fast-forwarded to the end. The last clip was dated June 4th, 2005. The timestamp read 3 a.m. exactly. The living room was empty, the lamp was off, the kitchen light was on. My father did not walk into the frame. For 30 seconds the room sat empty. Then, in the cushion to the right of where my father usually sat, the cushion he had been pressing his own body into for almost 3 years, an impression formed. It was the slow, gradual depression of a cushion accepting weight, but there was no body. No one had entered the frame. The cushion simply sank, evenly, as if a person of average adult size had sat down on it. Then, in the cushion to the left, where Walter had been sitting in the June 22nd, 2004 clip, an impression formed too. 2 cushions, 2 impressions. No one in the room. They sat like that for almost 2 minutes. Then the impression on the right cushion moved. It tilted. The cushion compressed unevenly, as if the invisible person sitting on it had leaned, slowly, toward the cushion on the left, and the impression on the left cushion tilted to meet it. The 2 depressions came together at the seam between the cushions, and they held that position, leaning into each other, for a count of perhaps 40 seconds. Then they separated. Both cushions slowly released. The impressions faded. The room was empty again. The kitchen light went off. The tape cut to black. I sat in the den. After a while, I noticed that I was not breathing very well. I made myself breathe. I made myself stand. I walked into the kitchen. I drank a glass of water. The clip was dated June 4th, 2005. I knew the date. June 4th, 2005 was the night my mother was admitted to the hospital. She had collapsed in the bathroom at 1:47 a.m. and my father had called the ambulance, and they had taken her in, and she had died 9 days later, on June 13th. June 4th was the last night my mother had slept in this house. June 4th was the last night my father had been a married man and not yet a widower. June 4th was the night the camera, which my father had been running in his own living room for almost 3 years, had recorded an empty room in which 2 people who were not visible had sat down on the couch together at 3 in the morning and had leaned into each other. My father had stopped recording after that night. There were no more clips on the tape. There was no way to know whether he had taken the camera down because my mother had gone into the hospital, or because he had finally seen something he could not unsee, or because what he had been looking for on those 3 years of nights had finally been answered. I did not enhance the last clip. I never enhanced the last clip. I want to be clear about that. I drove back to Cincinnati 2 days later. I did not take the tape with me. I did not destroy it either. I put it back in the box marked Home Videos on the 3rd shelf from the bottom in the garage, behind the snowblower. I put the memo back on top of it with the rusted paperclip, and I closed the box. I sold the house in October to a young couple from Grand Rapids who were expecting their first child. They asked me in the final walkthrough what I was doing with the contents of the garage. I told them I was taking the photographs and the documents, and they could have the rest. They thanked me. They were very kind. The box of home videos went into the dumpster at the end of the driveway on the morning of the closing. I did not retrieve it. I want to be clear about that too. I did not keep the digital capture. I had deleted it on the first day in the kitchen when I had seen Walter's face. I had emptied the recycle bin. I had not backed it up. The file does not exist, but I want to tell you what I have noticed since I have been home. I live in a 1-bedroom apartment in a building on Vine Street. My living room has a couch. The couch is dark green, not brown. It is not the same couch. I bought it at a furniture store in 2019, after my divorce, and it is the only couch I have ever owned. On the side table next to it is a lamp I bought at the same store. It is a different lamp. The shade is white, not pleated. There is no burn mark on it. About 3 weeks after I came home, I started waking up at night. Not every night, maybe twice a week. I would get up to use the bathroom or to drink a glass of water, and on the way back to bed I would walk past the living room. The first time I thought I saw the lamp on, I was not sure. The bedroom was very dark, and the living room was at the end of the short hall. There was a yellow shape at the edge of my vision. I went to look. The lamp was off. I went back to bed. The second time I was more careful. I stopped in the hallway and I looked. The lamp was on. It was a steady, even 40-watt yellow. I stood in the hallway and I looked at it for a long time. Then I walked into the living room. The lamp was off. I stood in the dark living room. I pulled the chain. The lamp came on. The bulb worked. I pulled the chain again. The lamp went off. I went to bed. The third time I did not get up. I lay in bed and I listened. I could hear the building. I could hear a car on Vine Street. I could hear very faintly the sound of someone in another apartment running water. I could hear, I thought, the sound of my own couch, the dark green one. The one I had bought in 2019. The one that had nothing to do with my father releasing its cushions. Slowly, as if a person of average adult size had just stood up from it. I did not get out of bed. In the morning, I went into the living room. The lamp was off. The couch was empty. There was no impression on either cushion. I made coffee. I went to work. I am writing this on a Tuesday in late November. I am writing it on my laptop, at my kitchen table in my 1-bedroom apartment in Cincinnati. It is 2 in the afternoon. The lamp in the living room is off. The couch is empty. I want to be very honest with you. I do not believe my father's house was haunted. I do not believe my apartment is haunted. I do not believe a man named Walter is sitting on my couch in the middle of the night. I believe my father loved a man in 1979 and lost him, and lived for 46 years inside a grief he could not name, and that he set up a camera in his own living room because he wanted, more than anything, to be visited. I believe the camera recorded what cameras record, which is the way light falls on a room over time. I believe my own brain, now, is doing the thing brains do when they are tired and unprocessed and have recently lost a parent, which is to see the things they expect to see. I believe all of this. I want you to know that I believe it. But last week I was on the phone with my Aunt Marcy. I was telling her about the apartment, about the lamp. I was making a joke about it. I was saying, Aunt Marcy, I think Dad's old lamp got into my head. I keep thinking I see it in the hallway. And she laughed, in the kind way she laughs, and she said, oh, honey, that lamp. And then she said, you know, your father did the same thing right after Walter died, right after. He told me once on the phone, this would have been the summer of 1980, he told me he kept seeing the kitchen light on at his apartment. He'd come home, and the light would be on, and he'd go and turn it off, and then later he'd look back, and it would be on again. He thought he was losing his mind. He told me he started writing his own notes, just a few notes to keep track. He'd write down the time. He'd write down what he'd seen. He said writing it down helped. He said as long as he wrote it down, he could keep it on paper instead of in his head. I asked her how long he had been doing this. She said she didn't remember. She said she thought maybe a year, maybe 2. She said he had stopped eventually. She said by the time he met my mother, he was fine. She said, why, sweetheart? Are you writing things down? I told her no. I told her I was fine. I told her I was just thinking about Dad. The memo is on my kitchen table. I lied earlier. I did not put it back in the box. I unpaperclipped it from the tape on the first day, and I folded it into the inside pocket of my jacket, and I drove it home with me to Cincinnati. And I've kept it on my kitchen table for almost 4 months now. It is the only thing of my father's I kept that was not a photograph or a legal document. It is the only thing he ever wrote that was addressed, even obliquely, to me. I read it most mornings. I read it the way you read a prayer you no longer believe in, but cannot bring yourself to throw out. I have not enhanced anything. I no longer own the tape. There is nothing to enhance. But I want to tell you, in closing, what I have understood about the memo, which I did not understand on the first day or on the 4th day or in the months I have been home. The memo was not a warning about the tape. The tape was already what it was. The tape had recorded what it had recorded. Watching the tape, copying the tape, even enhancing the tape, none of these things had changed what was on it. Walter had been in the room in 2004, whether or not anyone ever pressed auto-enhance on a free trial of consumer software in 2025. The cushions had compressed at 3 in the morning on June 4th, 2005, whether or not anyone ever sat at a kitchen table in Cincinnati and watched it happen. The tape was a record of something that had already taken place, and the record could not be made more true or less true by the way I looked at it. The memo was a warning about me. My father had spent 46 years not enhancing his own life. He had built a discipline around it. He had married a woman he loved, and he had raised a son, and he had managed a sales territory, and he had played poker on Thursdays, and he had done all of this on the condition of not resolving the image of the man in the brown cardigan on his couch in 1979 into anything he would have to name. He had kept Walter in the grain. He had kept Walter blurred, and he had survived, by which I mean he had lived, by which I mean he had been a man who could sit at the breakfast table with his wife and his son and ask for the salt. When he wrote Never Enhance, he was not telling me how to handle a videotape. He was telling me how to handle myself. He was telling me that there were things in my life, losses I had not named, men or women I had not let myself want, the marriage I had ended and not yet looked at, the years between my mother's death and his, in which I had called him on Sundays and not visited, and told myself I was busy, that were in the grain. They were on my own personal tape 44-C, and the tape was rolling, and the cushions were compressing whether I looked at them or not. And I had a choice, the same choice he had made, about whether to enhance. He had chosen not to. He had paid the price for that choice. The price had been a lamp that turned itself on in his living room every few weeks for 46 years, and a couch and a son who had not understood him until he was 11 days dead. He had wanted me to make a different choice. I think that now. I think the underlining of never, 3 times hard enough to tear the paper, was not the underlining of a prohibition. It was the underlining of a confession. He was telling me what he had done. He was telling me not to do the same. I am trying to take it as he meant it. I have been seeing someone, a counsellor, since October. I have been talking slowly about the marriage, and about my mother, and about the years I lost with my father in the name of being a busy adult. I have been trying to enhance. The lamp in my living room comes on sometimes at night, less often than it used to. Last week, it did not come on at all. I noticed this on Sunday morning when I made coffee, and I stood in the doorway of the living room, and I looked at the dark green couch, with both cushions undisturbed, and I felt something I do not know how to name. It was not relief. It was something closer to an apology, as if a guest who had been waiting a long time had begun, finally, to feel that he could leave. I have not put the memo away. I do not think I will. I have moved it, though, from the kitchen table to a small frame on the bookshelf in the living room, next to a photograph of my father at 26, which I found in the storage unit and brought home. In the photograph, he is standing on a porch on Beach Street in Lansing in 1979, with his arm around a man in a brown cardigan. They are both smiling. The photograph is not enhanced. It does not need to be. The light is good and the focus is sharp, and the man in the cardigan is looking at the camera, the same way he looked at the camera in 2004, the same way I suspect he has been looking at every camera that has ever been pointed at him, including this one, which is not a camera at all, but is the closest thing I have to one, which is the act of writing this down. I am writing it down because my father said that writing it down helped. I am writing it down because I do not want to keep it in my head. I am writing it down because the lamp has been off for 9 days, and the apartment is quiet, and the couch is empty, and I am, for the first time in a long time, alone in the room I am sitting in. I do not know if that will last. I am trying not to mind either way.